Hi, Marina. Thank you for joining us. This is episode 3. You're actually our first guest, our first official guest.
I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah.
And a big honor to be a guest.
We in our first 2 episodes, we just interviewed ourselves. To kind of, I don't know if you checked them out or anything.
I haven't yet, but I'm going to.
There's actually only one out, so right now, but we may put another one out in a few days here, and it'll be the second half. Me and Callum read our first stuff in our first half.
So I can subscribe to the podcast just like a usual one?
Please do.
Excellent. Okay.
Yeah. All right. So you're going to be reading a little bit from your book, the Voyage of the Morning Light. I have it here. Yeah. Did you want to kind of, talk about a little bit about it? I know you actually said a while ago that you had 2 different titles for it. One was The Difference. That's the Canadian title. Though I did buy this on .ca Amazon.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know you did. Good.
They're both on there, actually. Both copies. Yeah. And then the American title is obviously The Voyage, or the Voyage of the Morning Light.
Yeah, the titles are a mystery, and they're now governed by marketing mostly. So The Difference was my original working title, and I didn't actually think that I'd be allowed to keep it because you rarely are. But my lovely Canadian editor, Lynn Henriette Knopf, let me keep it. I had used The Difference because I wanted to keep that in the top of my mind about what I was trying to write about, that I was writing about the perception of difference that we all are prey to, and both actual difference between different places in the world and animals and humans, but also false difference, the difference that we are so keen and attuned to, but that is not real. So I wanted to keep that in the top of my mind as I was writing, and so The Difference made sense to me. Trying to figure out how we could get rid of that constant awareness of difference, how we could erase it from our subconscious, from our lowest kind of reptile mind. But then when the American edition came out, it was coming out from W.W. Norton in the States, which are just such a wonderful press. And my lovely editor there, whose name is Jill Bielowski, thought that it would be good to have, it was right in the pandemic, it was right as things had begun. And so she felt that it would be good to have a title that made you, gave an idea of the voyage, of the beauty of that trip that they take, trips, in fact. And so The Voyage of the Morning Light is a very evocative title. I was quite happy to change it. Every time sometimes when I'm talking about it, I say The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, because that's the one that comes up to my mind. But also there's The Voyage of the Beagle. And so these are books that I think are, suitable to have the story linked to. And so I actually like the American title, but The Difference is what it's called in my mind.
Okay, I was going to ask what you really saw it as, which would make sense. I feel like with the title you kind of center on or focus on is it doesn't really go away.
I find titles so difficult. I don't know about you guys, but sometimes they leap to mind and I don't know why they're there. And sometimes I have to spend, it's agony for me. I spend 2 weeks listing 750 stupid titles, like literally 750. Both with Good to a Fault, I had to change that title. I didn't have a title for a long time. And so that was a tough one to come up with. And also The Little Shadows, which is my book about vaudeville, I had called it the Bella Auroras in my mind because that's the name of the girls group. And the press thought that people wouldn't know how to spell it and it might be difficult to order. So, but that was a really painful one. That was so awful.
Do you have a preference for or like gravitate towards the titles?
Not at all.
No?
I actually like non-the titles.
Okay, like sentence-based titles. That's what I gravitate towards. I like sentence-based titles. Like my upcoming novel is What We Do on Weekends.
That's nice.
Yeah.
I have a superstitious liking for shorter titles, but it's not based in anything in reality. I can't even say that I like one kind of title or another. I just know that I don't like my own. that I just come up with the lamest titles. But it's wonderful when a title actually works, because then it gives you a little puzzle to solve as you read the book. You think, what is she talking about? What good to a fault? What does that mean? Or the little shadows. Who are the little shadows? They're not good titles, so don't look at those.
That's the kind of thing about the difference. It would have been more of like a puzzle to solve.
Yeah, although I had one review who cruelly hammered on the fact that the difference was used too much in the book. You really just can't please everybody.
I wonder if they would have thought that or noticed that if they read the other title.
They would have found something else to carp about.
Right, for sure. Yeah. Do you gravitate towards titles, like a certain type of title?
Sorry, were you asking me?
Yeah.
I guess I'm the only other guy here. Yeah, I do prefer the titles just as working titles, and then I also like single word titles as well. I'm not a big fan of long titles. They always remind me of like emo records and those like gargantuan
maybe
titles.
That's why I gravitate towards them. I grew up on emo records.
I'll tell you another thing I'm superstitious about is what the initials spell, because when they print the book, they always use the initials. And so all the files you receive from the publisher always just have GTAF, or in this case, TD. And so that was TD Bank, and that's not good. I don't want to think about the TD Bank too much. But if it's she has it together, and then it would be shit, every single time you got the book. So something to think about.
Well, that's the one nice thing about usually about longer sentence-based titles is they're not going to spell anything really terrible.
Yeah, but you'd be surprised how often they do.
Yeah, I do write down because I do set titles, but so I turn them all into acronyms before. So I would probably notice at least before I ever publish anything.
Yeah.
I did want to ask you about the kind of research that went into this before, so you can kind of set up the reading a little bit.
Sure.
Did you read a lot? I think in another interview I saw that you did 8 years of research before you started writing.
That's a little bit on the short side, but yeah, I was so lucky with this book that I'd thought about writing it for a long time, and I had avoided it because it seemed like it was too troubling a story, and maybe not my own story to tell, as we now think about appropriation and who gets to tell what story. And I agree with that. I think that we have to be really careful that we don't barge in and tell the stories wrongly. But then in 2009, I was lucky enough to win the Commonwealth Writers Prize. And they sent us to New Zealand for their final prize award ceremony, which was pretty lucky all by itself. But the Commonwealth Foundation likes to do a little bit of outreach when they go to places. And so they asked me if I would go to Tonga for a couple of weeks with a South African novelist called Mandla Langa, who's a wonderful person. And so we went off to Tonga for 10 days, I think it was. And we gave workshops and read in schools all over Tonga. There are thousands of schools in Tonga. It is the most missionaryized place I've ever been. Every church just thronged to Tonga to gain new souls. And so there are church schools all over. So we had a wonderful week, 10 days. But, the thing was that there were all these little kids, and they were all the kid in the story that I had been reluctant to write about. And suddenly, being there with Mandla Langa from South Africa and being with these children, and in the presence of all this religion too, it began to seem as if it was cowardly not to look at the people like me in the story. My piano teacher's mother had been the one in the original story who bought this little boy in the South Seas, and so I didn't feel for a moment that I could write it from his perspective, but her perspective is troubling and interesting. And so it began to seem as if I was kind of shirking the job of looking at what white missionaries, people of good conscience, people who believed that they were acting benevolently, how they proceeded to, go into these places and abscond with children and all the various other wrongs that were done. And at the same time, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was working its way across the country, and I went to the ones that were in Alberta and was again just sort of shattered by all the historical wrong that's been done. So you asked what the research was. So part of the research was having gone to Tonga, to have been in the South Pacific and to see what that geography, how that was different from where we are, especially cold in the prairies. And then another part of the research was to try and understand what the heck they were thinking when they went there. So to look at the religious philosophy of the time, and to look at the ideas about education and about how children should be set free from what was regarded as some kind of barbarism or primitive life and brought into the gracious company of basically Britain. And so there was the work of the philosophy and history and understanding at the time. But then I also was lucky enough again to get a shirk grant to go back and to go to Fiji and Tonga again. And I went to Indonesia and Hong Kong and Bali. Yeah, so I was the travel was the best part and the scariest part too. I mean, I was traveling all by myself mostly, and these are places, even Fiji, I was in Suva, and it's not like going to Montreal. And then to go to Tonga, I was so lucky though. A woman that I knew at the University of Alberta had done her PhD there many years before in anthropology, and she sent me to this remote island chain in the north end of Tonga, where I was really away from anything that we are used to living like, and back into a kind of way that they've been living for thousands of years and living very well. So I was very lucky to do that, and that was the pleasure of the research. And then the work of the research also was ships, because I didn't know in anything really about sailing ships, and you could spend your whole life finding out about that, and there are so many places to go wrong. But luckily I had a 12-year-old girl to see the ship through, so if there's any mistakes, I can just say, well, Kay wouldn't have known. She would have thought that was how it worked.
Yeah, the vernacular was something that really stood out to me. Like, I mean, I haven't been on a ship, so it's easy to trick me, for sure. But it did, like, it really felt that time period, and I felt it come through. And I
think that's another part of the research, is reading in the novels of the time, just getting into being immersed in the diction of how people thought and talked. And the ideas that they were able to hold because they had the vocabulary for them.
Mm-hmm. Did you spend time on a galley, did you say, yourself?
I did. I was able to go on a clipper ship in the Bahamas. Really, if you're going to pick a novel, pick something exotic where you'll have to do some research in good places.
Yeah.
So I spent another week in the Bahamas with my sister. I think, Callum, you probably were in my U of A classes when I was coming back from that.
Yep. Yeah, I was.
It was so amazing. I honestly could not have written the book without it. I would have been crazy to try and write a book about living on a ship without having at least been on a ship overnight and slept on the bosom of the waves.
Right. And I think you had also mentioned that people who have been on galleys or spent significant time have felt that you did it justice.
Well, you shouldn't say galleys because that's a specific kind of.
Okay, gotcha.
That's a Roman.
That's why I said you could trick me easily.
Yeah. Well, there's so many things to get wrong because, in fact, I was inventing this ship. It's based on the original ship that my piano teacher's mother sailed on, and my piano teacher was born on, called the Morning Light. But I changed, so it's either a brigantine or a barkentine, and I kind of mashed the two together to be able to use what I wanted. So really, don't tell any old sea tars what I did, but I cheated a little bit. One of the things is it's really hard to find I had no idea about this, but it's very, very hard to find a plan of the inside of a ship. You can find myriad drawings and pictures and photos of the outside, but to be able to figure out how the ship works inside, it took me a long time. And I didn't realize till very late that the reason that is because they were made from wooden models. So the shipwright would make the model, and then as they built the ship, they would take it apart. So even the models didn't survive because they were taken apart.
Right.
And I suppose that they needed to make the model to just make sure it was going to be seaworthy.
Right. One thing that just stick out to me as you're kind of giving the background is that you added two characters, but so the original story kind of almost has one, but there's Kay as well, right? And then can you kind of talk about what you thought how it changed the story by adding two, or what was your thought process, kind of the narrative thought process of adding two characters?
I think we all experience this as we write, where you have an intention and then as you write, you realize it needs to be adjusted. So, and also I don't work from a very detailed, I don't do a full synopsis. Sometimes I've had to, but I don't like it because for me, it traps me in a feeling that this must be true because I wrote it down sometime. So I don't work from that and didn't work from that in this, but I did have the actual story. So my initial intention was to talk about this woman on her honeymoon voyage and what would propel her to take this child. And so I intended to write Thea, was my intention. But as I went along, I found that what I needed was another eye, another observer in the story who had not already drunk the Kool-Aid, who did not already fully believe that everything they did was right, and who could look at it from a different, like literally a different angle because she's looking up, but also from the perspective of somebody who knew the children in the residential school in Alberta, not as a teacher looking down on these savages, but as one of the company of the children, and as they were friends of hers. And so to look at it from, even though she was separated from them, and of course she was infinitely more privileged than they were, but she was more one of them than she was one of the teachers. So I felt that I needed that other perspective, and it was enormously freeing to figure that out and to be able to add her to it. I mean, I tried to be fair to what she could think, because of course, even though she isn't fully inculcated, she does, of course, she did grow up among them. She is who she is.
One last question before you start reading. I keep adding them on, but because they come up and I think of them and I don't want to forget them. But so can you tell me about the moment when you realized that, because to me, Kay is the main character, that when it switched? Can you tell me that moment, like what was going through your head where you're like, oh, I realized Kay actually is the main person in the story, where previously it would have been opposite, right? At some point.
It was so early, and it was before I started writing. I was still in the research process, and I'm still, if we can call it a process, my habit is to write, 1,000 notes, really little, thousands of pages of notes. I'm just writing everything I think, dreams, whatever I wake up in the morning with. I'm spending, writing from research. And so I had been researching with the intention of only having Thea, but it was actually the adding of Kay that made the writing possible. I had a really hard time starting actual writing, and it was her addition, her voice that opened the book to me.
So when you're writing notes, are you resisting writing plotting? Because you said you don't really like to plot before, but you're just more kind of free-flowing ideas?
Mostly images,
Okay.
Really. Mostly like, and this is the central source of writing for me. And of course, this is different for everybody, but for me, it is these little flashes. I do think of them as slides, in the 50s when you'd sit in somebody's darkened living room and they would show these super saturated rectangles on the wall of their experience at the Grand Canyon or whatever, picnics. And so this sudden illumination, this image that is almost a projected here, look at this, see this. That is what is the source for me of writing. And so I'm in the process as I'm writing all these notes. It's really an imaginative building of a world by a succession of these images, and then noting them down. And I have to be really, really careful with my folders on the computer. So I do it all on the computer, but I have to be careful what I name the folders so that I can find the things again. And the worst thing is when you find, as you're cleaning up after a book's been published, when you find, oh man, I meant to put that in. And that was a beautiful image and I missed it.
Mine is called encyclopedia. I just have a big, huge thing, and I have characters and everything just listed off like a whole encyclopedia that I can sift through. But anyway, I could talk to you forever. Let's hear you read a little bit from The Voyage of the Morning Light.
Okay, I'm just going to go over here. And so this is from the middle of the first chapter. They've set sail, the Morning Light, a clipper ship, a brigantine coming out of Nova Scotia. And Yarmouth was then one of the major seaports in the world. Kay's sister, who is her half-sister and almost 20 years older than she is, has just married after a 10-year engagement, a sea captain. And Kay, although not originally wanted on the voyage, is going with them. So this is from the first night of the voyage. By nightfall, they had gone a long way, so that Francis was happy with their progress when he came down to the saloon for his supper. Mr. Wright, the first mate, came too. He had his own cabin farther along the corridor and might sit down to supper with them sometimes, although Francis said he would more often eat with the boys and Mr. Best in the crew mess. Mr. Wright was a lanky man, quiet, but with a firm disposition, perhaps a little unbending. He knew odd facts and was delighted to tell them, and was a student of astronomy. He promised to let Kay look through the little telescope he had made himself to see the rings of Saturn. Saying she was stronger after a rest, Thea came out in her Delft blue going-away dress, laughing at herself for succumbing to a weak stomach when she wished to be the perfect seafaring wife. Her ranging eye caught Kay licking salt from her wrists where the spray had coated them all afternoon, and later again meditatively tonguing the back of a spoon at table. Thea looked pointed and shook her head a fraction, because even when one was 12 years old, she would never cease telling one what to do. Perhaps she ought to go back to bed for a while longer. Dinner was short, both Thea and Francis wanting nothing after the summer pudding but to sit talking before the stove a little while. The skylight was open, though the night had turned cooler. They spoke softly to each other, a word or two rather than sentences. Kay was not one of them, and ought not to be there at all. Lena Hubbard came to set a tin of hot water in her little wash basin in the cabin, and showed Kay where to stow the tin on a hook below the basin when she was done, and where the pan hid for if one did not want to go along to the head, as they called the toilet closet on a ship, in one's nightgown. The cabin was satisfyingly trig and trim. Dark wood boards fit tight together made the walls, curved as the ship's wall was curved, and the last of the August twilight glimmered in through the port, a thick, round, bolt-fastened window over the bunk. The feather bed was tucked up taut with a blue blanket, and above it ran a shelf with short walls for a book and a small lamp. She got a lecture from Lena, which she did not at all need, having had one already from Francis, on how one could only have a lamp in a calm sea, and on putting out the flame very carefully. Lena gave her a pat on the knee, saying she was already a great sailor and they would soon have her in the Navy, speaking as if she was a child. At last, Thea came and kissed Kay's cheek and left, her blue skirt filling the door and emptying out into the corridor, to go back to Francis, who was her husband now, shutting the door behind her. You must learn to close doors on a ship. Alone in her bunk, Kay stared sightless at the wooden ceiling, recounting her life so far, putting it into language. I have bad dreams. I cannot be left. She was afraid to dream here, in case Francis put her off at the nearest port, because it had happened before at Orchard House, Aunt Lydia's spreading white villa out at Lake Milo. Then there'd been such a clanging and whispering, and the sacred telephone being used to ring up and summon Thea, so that she harnessed Auntie Bob's pair herself and drove the wagon out from Yarmouth town at 5 a.m. before the trolley car even began. Kay had not slept since waking the house by shouting with the nightmare, but had dressed herself and sat stiff as a mummy on the top stair, waiting for punishment or something worse. She felt darkness as huge as a bear inside her, eating and eating, becoming larger. But hearing the wagon's arrival, Kay had got up her courage to go downstairs. Aunt Lydia's daughter Olive stood bandy-legged in the front hall, staring at Thea with her pale fish eyes almost popping out, her upper lip strangely trembling. "It is too much, Theodora, too much. You cannot expect us to, and forced away, and the house in an uproar, and mother did not sleep one wink last night." Fish in the eye, rabbit in the lip, light hair frizzed over her ears. Kay found Olive very ugly and was glad she was not related to her at all, because she was Thea's cousin on her mother's side, and Kay had had a different mother who was not from this stupid place. "It was not so bad," Kay told Thea in her bedroom as they packed her trunk again. "I woke up in the upstairs hall, that's all. I had been shouting a little." "What were you dreaming?" Kay did not want to say. "The bare trees were coming down to the shore like bones walking, and we had to run. I had to warn them." Thea bent to look under the mahogany bed. "Where's the blue valise?" "The attic, I think. Aunt Lydia said it was too old and should be put away." "Well, run and get it." Kay hesitated because the attic was full of webs, with damp, sifted dust furred over everything, but she could not bear Thea to reproach her for cowardice, and the valise had belonged to her own mamma, Aliza Warner Ward, and she did not want to leave it in this house. She went, treading carefully on the step, only on the strips of carpet and never on the black walnut boards of the floor, and found the door that led upstairs and the heavy bakelite switch with a single bulb. Then up, coir matting on the narrow attic stairs, sharp under her stocking toes, into the lofty space under the roof. The light was dim so early, but there, tucked under the eaves, was her valise. EWW in gold letters on the side. Still clean, because Kay had only arrived yesterday morning. The only clear, clean thing in this blurred space. The valise's black bone handle fit her hand. The attic was only dusty, not haunted. The rope dangling from one rafter was not a noose, or at least not a noose for a person. In the cool darkness of the Yarmouth night, Thea heard her sister gasp. Then a tight, impending silence. She slid her feet from the quilt, darted across to the cot, and touched Kay's face to wake her. "All right, dear heart," she said. "All's well. Just a dream, just a dream." Kay's eyes were open, but she was not seeing this room at Auntie Bob's. She looked frantically to the wall and away and back again, staring. After a minute, she whispered, "I try not to think about things, but sometimes I can't help it. I can't help it, Teddy. I think it will escape and I will break open bleeding and die or run away and lose you." "And leave me, you mean?" "Yes, but then I would lose you. I will always find you." You could not find Annie when she ran away. Thea saw again the bent form beneath bare branches. Too late. "Do not leave me," Kay begged her. Thea opened the bed covers and climbed in beside her sister in the narrow bed. No, I will not leave you. I will never leave you or lose you or let you be hurt," she said, murmuring and whispering into Kay's ear, into her hair and the nape of her neck, as Kay turned in the cot, and gradually her shuddering stilled. Then there was only one day left before the morning light was to leave, not enough time to assemble her kit. But Thea took Kay down Main Street to Milady's up-to-date shop for boots with soft soles that would not skitter on the deck. Thea mourned the lack of a better clothier, but Kay yanked her braid so her neck hurt and said her midi blouse was fine if she was to be a sailor. She was afraid of being on the boat. The ship, she must always say, but she would not let them see that, not the Forrests, or hateful old Aunt Lydia, not Thea or Francis. Francis did not look at her askance. He nodded as to a sailor he was taking on and said he had a cabin saved for just such eventuality, although she would have to sleep with a crate of china at one end of the bunk. Thea laughed and put her hand on Kay's arm and said, "No such thing. It was only his joke." "I meant on the way home, of course," Francis said, his eyes calm. "We don't take China to China. That would be Coles to Newcastle." But they do not want a child with them. They want to be by themselves. It was foolish to think that, by themselves, because the ship was so full of people, almost all of them men and some very rough at that. So there was another lecture from Thea about whom Kay was and was not to speak to. The crew was lined up to greet them in the morning when they first came aboard. Tall, thin first mate, Mr. Wright, and the stout little bosun with the strong black beard. The third mate with thin pinkish hair, who was a gentleman from England come down in the world. She did not remember their names, but Thea had a list to study from. The huge second mate frightened Kay. His beet red nose, terribly pocked from some old disease, had grown beyond the usual to take up most of his face. She looked too closely and wished she had not, and then feared he was angry to be stared at. Then they met Hubbard, the steward, and his wife Lena, who would see to her and Thea, and the rest of the crew and the cook, down to the least idler, the ship's carpenter, who was very old and lay smoking his pipe in the lifeboat. Roused by some change in the rocking movement of her bunk, Kay woke. She had been asleep, after all, but not dreaming. She lay quiet, but the change in motion gave her a galvanized wakefulness that could not be ignored. The porthole only showed blank darkness. Kay pushed back the blankets and stood, careful with the rolling, to pull on her skirt and shawl over her nightdress and slip bare feet into new brown boots. The cabin door opened without creaking. She shut it carefully, silently, and made her way along the dark corridor to the stairs and up to the deck, like a cat creeping up to look out, except a cat would not hold so tight to the rope handrail, onto the deck. Everything was moving. Great swells raised the ship and sent it cracking and creaking down and forward, forward. As she came up on deck, the wind caught her hair and her skirt, so her bare legs felt the bite above her boots before she lifted her head to the tempest. But it was no tempest, it was only speed. The ship was scudding fast through the darkness. Everything bent forward, an italic hand racing over miles of blue-black paper sea. Sails filled the air around her, ropes taut and now shining, because now the blackness of night was broken in a blaze of moon beating down through the sails. The clouds had parted, and the moon, full, splendid, huge, the beauty of it. She was confounded, turned from a frightened, whining cat into a much larger thing, an angel of awareness. Beauty, beauty, beauty. She wept with it for a moment and then left off, merely accepting. The wind of their going lifted her hair and ballooned the sleeves of her nightdress. Along the port side of the ship came the second mate, lurching around the wheelhouse. He was the one who had frightened Kay that morning, only that morning at the dock in Yarmouth, with his blood-colored bulbous nose and shambling gait. But now, in the rush of the elements, in the star-jangling wind of the night and the full moon shining ahead of them, he came rolling up beside her and said, loud enough to be heard over the wind, "Isn't it marvelous, miss?" She looked up to his small eyes and scurfy straw hair, the nose receding in importance in this elemental air. Grinning like a great fool, he said, "Isn't it the most beautiful thing you've ever seen, to ride before the wind on a night with a moon?" Kay nodded and nodded. Yes, yes, beautiful. That was a little long.
Oh, that was excellent. Thank you so much. I think that was only maybe 14, 15 minutes.
Well, that's good. It's funny, choosing what to read and making it fit the moment.
Do you always, I assume you've done a lot of readings before. I actually saw you on the board of my climbing gym once behind Grant McEwen. I remember that, seeing your name at the Dirty Bird Cafe, I think it's called.
Oh yeah, I was reading there. I think it was the book launch for this. Maybe.
Yeah, that's why I think I saw it, but I had seen it maybe 2 weeks after you're already there on the chalk. Yeah. But I was going to ask, when you do readings, do you always do your first chapter, or do you have a specific chapter that you, or not like a specific, but you have like in each book a specific chapter?
I wish I had. Let me just see if I've got a book close by that I can grab. No, we just moved and all my books are all over the place. I have usually 50 or 60 readings marked. I mean, it seems like a lot, but I do a lot of readings, and one of the processes for publication is that you go after the book comes out. The publicist will book you everywhere they can, obviously, but there's a whole circuit of writers' festivals around the country, and so when I go to writers' festivals, you know, you might be on reading with different people every time. Sometimes they want 3 minutes, sometimes they want 7 minutes, sometimes they want 11 or 20 or 25 or whatever. They're very specific about what they want. And the worst thing in the world is when you read too long, I feel. If somebody's come to hear you and they expect you to read for 15 minutes and you read for an hour, they're dead. They will die and they will never buy your book. So it's courteous, but it's also important to read what people have asked you, I think. But also, so if you're on a panel that's like women in the tropics, that's a different reading from a panel on what really happened with residential schools. So you're answering usually a question. And so I usually have.
I really like that answer, that it's more audience based. You're gonna shift, and I like that you almost transform it for the audience of what kind of questions they would be interested in or topics they'd be interested in.
There is some point in starting at the beginning because you have less to set up. And also it's important to remember that you don't have to read what's in the book. You can cut it like in shreds and put things together that would normally, in fact, with this book and with a couple of other books, I've, for a longer reading, I've pulled out sort of strands that make sense, like following one character in a story. So it might be from 4 different places in the book that you're pulling together a little bit of a story. It's really, you're doing an ad for your book, mostly. And so it's good to free yourself from the idea that you have to read what's actually on the page.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, I was going to say one interesting thing that it made me ask myself was, if you're cutting these things for a reading, what's your thought process for not cutting them while writing?
It's too late.
It's too late. But it is an interesting thing, right? Because you're like, oh, this is not important enough to read, but why is it important enough to be in the book?
Well, okay, but there's 2 answers to that.
Right.
Because, of course, there are things you would cut because they are setting up for incidents later on. So I'd cut a whole list of characters there that I didn't need to read because you didn't need to know them because we weren't going to go on and read the rest of it. So there are lots of things you can cut because you're just making it into it's a postcard instead of a story. But also it is frustrating it's why it's really good, I think, to read before your book is published. It's really good. I love reading work in progress because it does show you, getting ready for the reading shows you stuff that you can cut. I love to cut. I know my books seem really long, but they usually start out like 1,200 pages and then they get cut in half.
That is another thing I noticed that on the subject of long or length. A lot of things I was reading just other people's responses to it or feelings. And then Callum had also said this is his experience, but it was especially true, or maybe answered it when you're reading, that it almost feels slow. When you're reading, it's almost like you have to sit and stop on each word, and then you really slow down your own reading of it. And I think that maybe answered why. It's like when you're reading it, you almost slow down, and you got to stop and pause every once in a while, I think, and kind of chew on what you just heard.
Yeah, there's no doubt that hearing it out loud is a different process than reading it silently. Also, by the time you get to anywhere near being ready, you've read that thing 800 times. And so you don't actually read it anymore. When you're reading it with your eyes, you might be looking for typos or something, but you're not really, it's not the same kind of attentive reading that you do when you read it out loud. Right. So in fact, in that bit I just read, I found a phrase I would certainly cut and will always cut from readings from now on.
Right. Do you want to say what that is, or do you want to hold that in?
No, I'm going to keep that to myself. No, I'll tell you, because it's my newest pet hate, and it's because, I teach a lot, and oh my God, this is a phrase that is so overused, is she made her way across the room. Now, as I was reading, I was saying to myself, yeah, but it's fair here because it's dark and she's in the corridor of a ship and it's moving. So she has to go carefully. She has to kind of make her way along the hallway. But yeah, my students use it every single time anybody moves anywhere, they make their way.
Yeah, there is a definitely, and you can maybe speak to this a little bit, Callum, but I think when you're starting out in writing, like fiction, there's an overemphasis on, or desire to write every little action, like every movement that happens. Yeah,
which would be appropriate in the case of traversing like a ship on the high seas, because you are kind of like making your way. But surely there's better language to use.
Well, actually, it's a nautical metaphor, though. You're making way when the ship sets sail. So I'm gonna give myself permission for that one, kind of, but I would never use it again. But the thing is that stage management stuff. Sometimes you have to write it in order to be able to imagine the scene and to fill it in for yourself. But that's the sort of stuff you go back and cut out.
Right.
You put her arm out and clasped the doorknob. She rotated it clockwise. It didn't open. She rotated it left. Or you could just say she went to the basement.
Right.
And there she is. She's in the basement.
I've been reading Bakhtin a little bit, Mikhail Bakhtin, and he talks a lot about how time is different in books, and you don't have to say each step. It's just like there's relative time and there's book time. Which is interesting. One thing you had also mentioned in a different interview, and it was, I think a lot of new writers like to hear this, but how much you hate first drafts.
Oh man. I know people who like them and who find the editing process tedious, but are you guys like that? Do you like writing first drafts?
No, it's very painful. It's very painful.
It's
painful?
Yeah, it's very painful, but editing is so much fun because you're economizing the language that you've already used and you're like honing it to be something that actually like does something. You're making it into a tool. You're taking this, I guess like piece of flint and making an arrowhead.
Yeah, exactly. But the finding the flint, I find very difficult. I really do. I find writing a first draft of a novel, like a short story is bad enough, but a novel, it's physically excruciating. It's more than painful. It's just horrible. I don't know, and it doesn't get any easier. Although I think editing, like the editing process gets maybe faster. But the first draft it's tough. I always feel like a spider. I'm spinning this story out of my own body somehow. And I feel like I need to eat or something. Luckily, alcohol does not help me at all in a first draft. So
it doesn't help me either. I find after like 10 minutes, I just want to go do something else. Doesn't help the pain.
Almost everything I want to go do something else after 10 minutes. Yeah.
How long does let's say this length of novel, how long does that take you on a first draft?
Well, this one, it's a little bit hard to say because I was researching for so long. Like, do we count that? But let's not count that. The actual writing of text, I really started writing in 2016, so 3 years.
For the first draft or for the whole thing?
No, sorry. So, but almost 2 years for the first draft. And then the revisions at that point were actually faster. And I also am so fortunate to be working with the same editor. And so we have, so that goes faster in a way. Although, let me warn you that the editing process in publishing is the slowest thing you will ever have encountered in your lives. However, at least the conversation between me and Lynn Henry, my longtime editor, is faster because she knows me better. I know her. I know what she means when she very delicately inserts a little question mark or something. Then I know to unpick that whole scene. It's a little easier for her. For example, one of the things that the book follows the voyage into the South Seas, and I was working with the original letters from my piano teacher's mother, who had sent back letters from all over the South Pacific. And so I was working with those letters. And so as much as the book had a structure, it was that voyage. But they go to Hong Kong, and it seemed like it was kind of important. The Hong Kong trip was interesting. They met interesting people. And I'd written this scene in the Hong Kong trip, which is my favorite scene in the book. And in fact, I just sent it to Lynn Cody, had loved it, and Madeline Tien had loved it. I just loved that little scene. And then, or Helen Oyeyemi thought that was her favorite scene in the book. And then Lynn said, I think we should cut the whole Hong Kong stop, that whole port. But because we know each other really well, I didn't have to fight her. I didn't have to, go through that agonizing process of, no, here's why it's necessary, and you just don't understand, and this is my best scene. So it was easy. I just cut it. Although I do still miss that scene.
It's interesting that you had said that you had got like kind of some firsthand letters, because one thing I had written down was that it almost felt like epistolary, that cutting back and forth, or almost like reading journal entries
Between the two women, the two voices?
Yeah, because they're just such like snapshots almost.
Well, I think maybe Thea's even more so, and Thea's are many of the Thea's scenes. For example, there's a little scene in there where they stop at St. Peter and St. Paul, these mysterious rocks that are in the middle of the ocean. And there's a scene there where the sea captain husband goes off in the rowboat to fish and takes her with him, takes Thea with him. And that is straight from letters. So maybe some of the letter language crept over. It was weird working in two voices, because one, as you say, Kay is the main character, and one is much more central to my thinking about the ideas in the book. But I also love Thea and love her as a younger sister who doesn't really totally understand her and wishes she was otherwise.
Would you ever consider writing an epistolary novel? Like, do you ever have come to this fork in the road where you're like, I could write this in narration, or I could write it in letters?
Well, in the Little Shadows, it's three sisters, and about 2/3 of the way through the book, they get split up. One goes to England, one goes to the South in the States, and one is in the prairies. And they write letters back and forth, and I loved writing those letters. That was really fun. They were really short letters because, they wouldn't have been able to send longer than a page or two.
I liked the littlest sisters letters the best.
Yeah, me too. So I was playing with spelling and with what she was choosing to tell her sisters about the real horrors of her life. Yeah, thank you, Callum. That's nice that you remember them.
Was it in that book, were they all different perspectives in the same chapter, or did you split those up by chapter?
No, the book that has the most perspectives all at the same time is Good to a Fault, where it slides back and forth very as if I don't even know the rules. I just did what I wanted to. But I worked really hard on that to make sure that you didn't feel seasick as you were reading it, but that you knew whose eyes you were seeing from each time. But man, it is a very strong reluctance in I think all editors believe that it's wrong. You shouldn't do it. So I sort of, want to do it anyway. Really, why can't I do it? I can do it if I want to. But I do feel like you have to make sure that you know which horse you're riding. But in the Little Shadows, it was originally a little bit freer, and in the editing process, we because it was so episodic, it was so like short scene, like a vaudeville act. So I did bow to the prevailing winds and say, okay, fine. Each one will be in a separate little scene with and they each had little titles on them.
There's an old saying that I think it was Picasso, but to put the nose somewhere else, you have to know where it goes first.
To put the nose somewhere else, you have to know where it goes. That's very funny.
Yeah. So to break the rules, you kind of have to know them already.
Yes. Oh, completely. And he's just such a good example of that too. Yeah, I did know the rules, and then I chose to break them. And I'll defend it in Good to a Fault. I think that it actually works. But I also know that I really, really thought about that and worked really hard on making sure that you knew where the nose was.
Guy Vanderheg had said what it was called, and I don't know if you know this, but he called. I mean, this might be his word. I don't know if this is actually what it's called. He might.
I think this is his word.
Serial subjective omniscient.
Yeah, because that's kind of bullshit, because it's not omniscient, and his is not either. And so each of it, like, look at The Last Crossing, which is, I think, the best Canadian novel. But so he's going chapter by chapter, but in each one, those are not omniscient narrators. Right. Each one of those narrators only knows what that woman knows, or what Custis knows. So yeah, he's
well, because I think that's the subjective, right? That it's subjective to them, but an omniscient, because it's not in their head, it's someone else looking in their head.
I disagree. I think but I'd have to go back and look at it. But I think it's much more closely akin to Close Third, what James Wood talks about.
Right.
So more in the Madame Bovary, where we are privileged to understand and see everything that is inside their head. We know everything they can think, feel, understand.
Mm-hmm.
I think the feeling of omniscience is just because Guy's a brilliant writer.
Right.
It's a broad canvas, and you're seeing what a landscape that you're seeing through those characters' eyes. But I don't think it's ever omniscient. I think omniscient is a different thing.
Right. We actually have him next on the podcast. That's our next guest, and we're doing until I forgot the Jimi Hendrix experience. The Jimi Hendrix experience. That's what we're gonna do.
Oh.
We're gonna look at. Yeah, he's gonna read a bit from it, I think.
Excellent. And have you guys been working with him?
Yes,
school?
I have a class this semester. Yeah, with him. He's excellent.
You're so lucky. He's one of my favorite people on the planet. I just love him, and I respect him from the bottom of my heart.
He does radiate, and I think you do too. A bit of warmth. You know?
It's funny because he's kind of almost a bit shy, really. I mean, he's like not necessarily a really folksy kind of guy all the time. He golfs with my husband, or he used to golf with my husband a long time ago. So I knew him as a golfer first.
I would have expected it from the writing because I read all his short stories first, and then I did not expect him to have that kind of warmth because there's almost a curmudgeon aspect to a lot of his writing.
Curmudgeon. Yeah, I think, well, he kind of plays on that too, and that's good. Who else are you working with?
This semester? Sherry. And then I have a graduate English class. I'm forgetting his name right now.
What's the class in?
It's kind of weird. It's like films, but also novels. And then that's why I'm doing some like Bakhtin theory.
I'm teaching Heart of Darkness and Apocalypse Now in my class that starts on Monday.
Book or the movie of Heart of Darkness?
Well, both.
Right.
So, but I'm using Apocalypse Now rather than any other movie of Heart of Darkness.
Right. Gotcha.
But the book, it's interesting to be looking at them both. And who are you working with, Callum? Same?
The same. Not the same film studies class, which is too bad because I really do enjoy the crossover between the written word and the projected image. I'm working with Sherry in poetry, and I have a Victorian novel class that we're reading North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell right now, and it's very good to be back in Gaskell land.
Yeah, I just downloaded. What's her first one?
Not Mary Barton. It's
Oh, for pity's sakes, the big one, her most famous one. Well, you might say North and South is. Anyway, I'd never read it, so I just put it on my my iPad to read in the middle of the night because I'm not sleeping very well these days. I don't know, pandemic perhaps. I'm trying to get some good reading done.
Do you find the novel is more comparable to movies, and the short story is more like a short film, or do you?
No, I think that one of the reasons that Heart of Darkness and Apocalypse Now work so well is because Heart of Darkness is a novella. So it's so short that you're able to, it's really as a short story, I think usually is, it's one idea being looked at pretty thoroughly. And I think a movie usually is as well. So no, I think movies are closer to short stories, actually. I don't pretend to any authority on movies, but I like them.
Yeah.
And I didn't know until I was working on it for my class last term that Michael Hare wrote the screenplay for Heart of Darkness. Michael Hare, who famously wrote a book about Vietnam called Dispatches. It's one of the best Vietnam.
Yeah, I have it. I have not read it, but I know the title.
It's really, really good. Yeah.
I was writing a short story on Vietnam, so I bought all these books, but then half of them are just unread.
Which ones did you read? Things That Carried?
I did read The Things I Carried. Yes, I read that, and that's one of my favorite books of all time. Just the idea that fiction is more true than nonfiction. I really like that. That may have maybe why I stopped reading the nonfiction ones.
Yeah, well, and Dispatches is written with as fiction. It's written as
it's like a narrative
reporter's
nonfiction, right?
experience. Yeah, it's amazing. I used that as one of my memoir pieces, in fact, in the last class. Yeah, it's a good thing I'm teaching her. I wouldn't read half the things I read.
That's why I am enjoying taking classes, because it's been a while for me, so I'm back.
Yeah.
Before Callum, you had a few questions that I didn't want to skip over. I've really just been going off the off the questions, off the cuff.
You can just flip it and cut. I'm sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely fine. I am the shy guy of the group. Out of the 5 senses, Marina, or 6, depending on who you ask, which is the one that you like to write the best?
I'm strongly visual. That's the one that comes most naturally to me, is the way things look, and the visual image carries a lot of that sixth sense. For me, it carries a lot of connotation, and what you might consider extra perception comes through the eyes. So I would have to say sight, even though it's really probably almost everybody's strongest. But I also like to try and think about sound as I'm writing, almost to make it a task that I consciously think about what the sounds are. Smell comes easily. I don't have to worry about that. It just, something's that's almost like in the dream state. In fact, I quite often smell things in my dreams. And so in the dream state of writing, I often know what the smells are, and they just naturally go into the work. And I don't know about touch. I guess I think about texture of things and touch as well. What about you?
What about me? I adore sight. I think, like you said, it is the one that everybody knows. And I think that's more of a case as film has sort of supplanted the written word. But I enjoy trying to describe things not quite as they are, but still as they are in sight. I think that's something that you can do when you're writing sight. Smell is also very important to memory. So I think that sometimes.
Can I ask you both a question about this question? Did you guys consider that dialogue is sound?
Yes.
You did? Okay, your answer, okay.
And absolutely. And the sound of how people speak, diction is hugely important to me. And in fact, here's a Guy Vanderhaeghe thing. He talked in a wonderful essay he wrote about writing historical fiction about how he hates to have Boadicea in a metal brassiere talking as if she was, a feminist, and sort of the imposition of that kind of anachronistic diction. He was railing against it, and I too don't like it. I like to delve into what people actually would have sounded like. So that's put up a bit of a barrier for me between me and Hilary Mantel's, for example, that series on Thomas Cromwell. For me, the diction is so wrong that I can't get past it. I mean, if I was alone on an island with those books, I'm sure I'd read them, but at the moment there's like a little barrier. I can't read them.
There is one thing I noticed in this reading, and I listened to another reading you had done. I can't remember which one it was, but for everyone else's voice, you actually have an accent that you do. But for Thea and Kay, you do not. It's your voice, which I thought was very interesting.
Ian, my husband, who was our CMP for years. He's now retired, thank goodness, and was a poet before he started. But when we first went to the RCMP, went into his job, I would call the detachment and he would get a message saying some English lady called for you. So I'm sorry. I think it's Nova Scotia, really, but it might just be pretentiousness. I don't know.
Yeah, it was. I couldn't place it, but I'm really, really bad at accents. So I just felt like it was a slightly different, older voice.
It might be Nova Scotia.
Okay.
It was interesting. Speaking of memory, Callum, it was interesting to I went to Nova Scotia, I forgot to say, when I was doing the research, and my piano teacher had died without any family, which freed me up to write the book. But she had left all of her stuff to the museum in Yarmouth. And so I could just go and again, as I did when I was a child, root through her drawers. But things smelled like her house. You know, it was very, very evocative and very useful to me to remember what it was like to live in Nova Scotia.
I did forget that question. I was going to ask you how you got those letters.
Well, I went there and
like,
there they all were. But then here's the funny part, because like really do your research in a larger sense or in a lazier sense. So I went there and laboriously photocopied every single letter. And then on my way out through the gift shop, there was a book where somebody had published the letters. So it's and I ended up using the book at least as much as I used my photocopies. It's called oh shoot. It's The Sea Letters of Grace Ladd is the real title, but it's got a nice little subtitle. I forget.
I'm sure if they search that, they'll find
it. Yeah,
it.
The Sea Letters of Grace Ladd is how it's published. And it was wonderful to have them. But it was just funny that it was like, I come upstairs from the basement where I've spent 3 days photocopying, and there they all are. But she'd edited them, so it was nice for me to have the whole thing. And also in their handwriting was really good for me.
Right. Do you want to ask one more question, Callum? And then we'll do our 10 quick rapid fire questions and close her out.
Yeah, of course. This one is because I've read The Difference, Little Shadows, and Good to a Fault. Between like historical fiction novels and like, I guess, contemporary or general fiction, which is more fun for you to write?
I'm a little troubled here, Callum, that you've just confessed that you didn't read Close to Hugh.
I tried, okay, and I really loved.
Is it worse that you tried and you didn't read it?
No, that's even worse.
Okay, let me show my ass here for a second. I picked it up at the Camrose Public Library while I was waiting for my partner to be finished with something, and I read it and I was like, wow, this is fantastic and awesome, and I love it very much. And then just like, I don't know, like something popped in my head and I closed the book and like put it back on the shelf and walked away. And then I'm like, I really should get that book. And then
okay, you've
and then here we
covered
are.
your tracks very successfully.
I'm sorry.
Not at all. It's funny because there's a student at MacEwan who I will always love, because anytime anything comes up on social media, she always says, my favorite book is Close to Hugh. That's the best book I've ever read. And it's very, very sustaining. Like, you know, we write in this sort of weird solitude and vacuum, and we don't even know what anybody thinks. And then we have to keep getting up in the morning and doing it again. So it's good to have somebody going, yeah, that was so good. I really loved it. Do I like historical or contemporary? Was that what you were getting at? Yes. Before you put your thumb in your foot in your mouth? Callum, I feel so sorry for you, because you've had to read so many of my books, and I apologize, because Callum was in a course where I went away for 2 weeks and my replacement decided to teach one of my books. And so I wasn't even there when you had to study Good to a Fault. Thank goodness. I don't know. I think I think it's a marketing mistake for me to go back and forth, because I think people like to read the same book. They just really want another book like that. And so it's kind of a mistake for me to go back and forth, because if somebody really loved The Little Shadows, they're probably going to hate Close to Hugh. So I don't know. I just seem to be, you know, you write what you're given to write. And it just seems that I'm given to write something that is the way we live now, and then something that is plaguing me from the past. And it seems that they alternate.
I think that's very, I don't know, appropriate, I think, for people who are so engaged with humanity as authors are. I was talking to Amy McInnes the other day, another student of Marina's, and he sent me this video of someone just like bad-mouthing Dracula by Bram Stoker, and it reminded me of how, like, we read the classics because they show us the things that were important to the people of the past, and the things that frightened them, things that they loved. And oftentimes we find that we are afraid of and love similar things. And so I think it's very appropriate that you are so adept at writing the past and the present?
I think that when you're, not always, because people are writing for different purposes. I mean, I think you can write a historical book mostly for the purpose of instructing or allowing people the luxury of living in a different world. But for Guy Vanderhaeghe, and for a lot of the people that I know who are writing, Jill Adamson, for example, that when we write about the past, we're really writing about now. So I'm writing about the past to talk about residential schools in a way that would be inappropriate for me to talk about them now, or would be impossible. And I'm writing about the past to think about how we can find a way to, about things that are still wrong. Yeah.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
And I don't know whether I like one or the other better, but I'm writing a book set in the present now.
I heard it's going to be a little bit more autobiographical.
Well, yeah,
As much as it can.
I'm in that horrible doldrums right now where I'm mostly writing notes and not writing text. And, you know, even though I say I hate first draft, I hate not having a first draft even more.
Oh, for sure.
So yeah, it certainly stems from my own experience, but I don't even know yet how autobiographical it'll be. I don't even know.
I was going to ask about the themes of like the residential schools. Does that come out while you're writing, or did you have that before, or is it something you realized that you wanted to talk about that's going on now?
It was, I'll tell you how it arose. It arose at the very beginning of thinking about the book, because so what prompted the book period was that one day in like 1990, I was Googling. It was when Google first came in, and, you know, you'd Google yourself, and then that would be 3 entries, and then you'd stop. And so I Googled everybody else I knew. And then I Googled my piano teacher, who had been kind of an important figure in the town in Yarmouth. And instead of a photo or anything nostalgic for me, what came up was just a picture of a speaker and her voice, speaking of the senses. So it threw me back into childhood and threw me back into, it was a horrible, cracked old, you know, old lady's voice, full of self and authority and contempt. And she was telling this story to the Yarmouth Historical Society about, and this was a story I'd never heard, even though she told me 100 stories about her mother on this honeymoon voyage and going and taking that little boy away. And the story, and, you know, the few degrees of separation from me, this was not some story somebody was telling about some other white lady somewhere. This was my piano teacher's mother, and my piano teacher was a person I admired, and I know that I was strongly influenced by, and so the separation was very, very nothing. And the feeling of shame was the same as the feeling of shame that I think a lot of people like me feel when they hear about residential schools, which we didn't hear about really, you know, until about 10 years ago. It was the first time they began to really tell that story, or have the story known by everybody. So that there was the similarity between listening to this story of somebody absconding with a little boy from the South Seas and the feeling of shame, you know, inherited shame, nothing I did myself, but still this feeling that wrong was done and something needs to be done about it. Yeah, so it was right from the very beginning that I wanted to talk about those schools.
Do you find that's common for you, or do you think they usually develop while writing?
I think I often don't have any idea what I'm writing about when I start. I have to, you know, wait till I see what I say, till I know what I think. Mm-hmm. And I will start because I'm thinking about something and it won't let me rest. But I haven't done the thinking yet, and I do the thinking while I'm writing.
Gotcha.
That sounds sensible.
I think that's pretty common, but there's the idea of the plotter versus pantser, fly by the seat of your pants.
Yeah, I like the little the headlights one. You can only see about 50 feet ahead of your car in the headlights. You can drive all across the country in that light.
I've never heard that. No. And I've heard architect versus gardener as well.
Yeah, I would certainly call myself an architect because I'm a great one for house plans, and I'm a terrible gardener. But I guess that I really am more of a gardener in the writing.
Let it grow. Yeah. Well, Callum, is there anything else you want to add? You're muted right now.
I just noticed that there was like one last question, but it's almost been answered organically through the course of this discussion. It was the one about questions of morality. Like most of your books pose moral questions, oftentimes with more than one answer. How soon in your process do you apply or conceive of these moral or thematic questions?
I hate to say this because I don't think this is how I think of myself, but I think that moral question is actually what's bugging me when I start. And so, and in everything I can, it's almost like a sort of a buried indignation. Something's wrong. There's this thing that's wrong. And interestingly, an awful lot of my stuff is about children who are not sufficiently mothered, who are not being looked after very well, or whose parenting is being divided. And yeah, anyway. And my friend Catherine Aschenberg pointed this out to me last year and said, when I was having a bit of an issue with my mom, and said, I do see this in your work. And I was like, what? Yeah.
Apologize the authors some more about what they write.
One thing I've noticed in really, really great works is the answers to these moral questions are often ambiguous. They don't actually directly answer these questions. They really provide questions, not answers.
Yeah, that's ideal. I'm not even, I mean, obviously you'll feel pretty clearly what my feeling is about residential schools in that book, but I am not trying to make, it's not instructional, because I think that Thea completely believes that she's right. I don't think, she has very few moments of uncertainty. Mm-hmm. And I don't, I respect her in a certain way, even though I think she's wrong.
All right, well, we'll do 10 quick questions and sign her off. It's really hard to actually stay under an hour, I got to say. We're about 15 minutes over, but that's okay. Doesn't really matter. I think people can stop watching if they ever feel like tapping out.
That reading is too long.
No, it's perfect. So what time of day do you write?
I started writing at 5 a.m. when my kids were little, and I still do it. But then I also write from 9 to 11, and then I write from 11 to 5, and then I write from 5 to 11, and then I stay up for a couple hours.
Maybe we just found out. Yeah, I was going to say, maybe we just found out why it's so painful for you.
Yeah. I'm slow. I'm just not good at it.
I'm about a 1 to 2 hour person a day.
Well, so Miriam Caves is like that. She said to me, it's like cleaning toilets. You get in, you get out. Like, I would never write a book if I spent 9 to 11 in there.
I can usually do about 1,000 words in that time. Usually, that's what my goal is. Callum, do you have a specific time?
I'm a bit like a cat when the mood strikes me, but I do like to write sort of around this time of day, actually, that 2:33 to 4, and then that usually goes until supper time. But I keep hearing people being like, oh, I wake up really early and write, and I think, damn, maybe I should start doing that, because it makes it like, it might make me think that what I'm doing is work, and it might make me do a little bit more.
I'll make one plug for writing at both ends of the morning and night, is that I find in the early morning, I'm a bit more still in touch with the subconscious, with the slate underneath. It's a little bit less, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Just a little bit more in the area to catch things that you don't necessarily think you don't know you know.
I just did a talk on why beginning writers often fail to write. So I was thinking about this question quite a bit. I used to write 7 to 9 or 8 to 10 at night, but I found things in life can come up at that time. So now I write first thing in the morning, even though it's not my best time to write. I think it's just most important. If I really want to write again, I can, but I can't go back and write on a day I didn't write.
You know, that's such a good piece of advice too, is you're giving your own work the preference first. You're giving it the first priority, rather than fitting it in at the end of the day. And if you can do that, I think it's a really good piece of advice.
We may not get through all 10, but we'll keep going. We like to talk, but what's your writing space look like? Are you in it right now?
I'm in it.
Gotcha.
Yeah, it's a nice little office. Got a big window, and have you seen it, Callum? You've been in my house, but I don't think you came upstairs. It's got a really high ceiling. What?
I have not, no.
Well, when the pandemic is over, we're gonna have such a party, boy. And there'll be people all over the place. It's usually kind of a mess, unfortunately, but I'm working hard on keeping it a little bit less cluttered, even though sadly clutter does seem to be part of my process.
What's your favorite writing space you've ever had?
When I first started writing seriously, I was in the basement of our house in Cochrane, and my kids were like 1 and 3. And so I had the furnace. It was a furnace room, really, but I had a little shield, like a screen between the furnace and my desk. And in order to make my children let me work, I got my neighbor to cut my door in half, so I could close the bottom of the door and leave the top door open, so I could hear them and see what they were doing and not worry about them, and they could talk to me, but they knew they couldn't come in because I was working.
I've heard often that the less ideal spaces are often writers' favorite spaces.
Yeah, because there's nothing to do. My favorite is Jean Kerr, the writer from the 50s who wrote essays, and she said that in order to write, she would go sit in the car. And then once she'd reread the manual, there was nothing to do but write. Made me laugh to think of her every morning reading the manual again before she works.
So I write, I'm doing this thing recently where I don't actually turn on my phone till about 1 p.m. off, no internet. Very, very helpful. So I actually am writing at I'm house sitting right now, but I'm writing downstairs at the dinner table. And it's I think it's so far my favorite writing space I've ever had. It just seems so peaceful. I'm away from everything else, and I know I'm only there to write.
It's fantastic.
Callum, what's your writing space right now?
You're also looking at it. This is one corner of my apartment. I've got my back to 2 walls. I'm next to the radiator, and I can see the door. I've got an original Amy McInnes.
It's beautiful.
Yeah. Would you like to see it?
Yeah, I'd love to. She's such a good artist.
It's a hard thing about rapid fire questions is I want to hear Callum's answers too.
Yeah.
Do it for my birthday. It's
she knows you so well, Callum.
I would love to get him tattooed on me one day.
There's a studio here called Honeybee that does a lot of bugs.
Yeah, it's around the corner from my place actually. Yeah. But yeah, this is it. I have this rolling table that I put my laptop on, and I just sit down and get to work.
Is it secluded, or is your partner in the room often?
Often, yes. Yeah, because her workspace is.
I've only ever seen Callum from this corner, so it's a whole new world for me.
Yeah,
this is amazing. I've never seen this either.
Yeah,
I do love this about this current reign of terror, is that we get to see inside people's houses. That's great.
Well, I was going to say, I've only ever seen this little tiny notch of Callum's life. I thought this is all that existed.
It might as well be.
It's all that you need.
There's also the snack pantry, but
Marina, what are you reading right now?
I just finished Piranesi by Susanna Clark, and if you haven't read it, I loved it. you sometimes go through kind of a reading desert. I am reading a lot of manuscripts and student manuscripts and stuff. So I sometimes these days don't have a book that I'm really devoured by. But boy, Piranesi is wonderful. She wrote Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which is sort of a fairy historical fantasy kind of fantastic book. But this is entirely different, and I think both of you would really, really, really like it. Piranesi.
What nonfiction book do you always recommend? Book on writing, specifically.
Well, I usually recommend Ursula Le Guin's Steering the Craft. I think that it's very lucid, and it's good for people who are working by themselves, don't have a community of writers, because it gives you exercises that you can do, or you can do them with a couple of people if you want to. And I just think that her thinking about writing cuts through a lot of the traps that people fall into and that they think is the way you write. But I also really, really like John Gardner's Art of Fiction still. I think that what he talks about why we write and what we're trying to achieve is really good, because it gets you to be to elevate your ambition a little bit. It's not enough to, write the first 7 pages so an agent will buy your book, but to examine why you're doing this at all. What is your soul reaching for?
I've read every John Gardner book on fiction, including like on moral fiction.
Yeah.
I have not read any of his fiction though. I bought a few and they just never came. I bought a few maybe 2 years ago and it just never came.
Oh no.
I think he's just not printed a lot. Maybe they just never printed it.
It's funny because he's somebody who I think is a bit of a cautionary tale for writers, because he wrote for his students and he taught all the time. Mm-hmm. You have to be sure that you're privileging your own writing.
I did wonder, because he's such a wonderful writer about writing, about what is it about his fiction that didn't really capture people as much?
Well, here's another example. Well, I think the thing is that the principle can be good, and yet you just don't really like that particular aspect, that particular writing, that particular guy's writing. So Stephen Pressfield is another really good example for that, because I don't really like his books. I mean, Bagger Vance was made into a pretty good movie, but it's not my kind of fiction at all. But boy, The War of Art was so useful to me. Just having somebody say, there is a force that's working against you, and there's a reason why you can't get your writing done. It's okay. It's working against everybody's art, and you can combat it. That whole idea of resistance that he puts forward in that book, The War of Art, was really useful to me.
That is something I've noticed that people you surround yourself with often will try and pull you away from it. And I think he talks about that as well. I've read one book from him. I think it's a book on 300.
Yeah, because he writes all this sort of, it's like warlike. It's like the movie 300, which again is not my sort of movie. He writes about the Amazons.
Very digestible, like easy read.
Yeah.
And
this is not in any way to diss him, actually, because
I also have the Amazon book. I do, but I haven't read it yet. Yeah. Last question. What has been on your mind lately about writing? Like, what's something you've just been kind of chewing about writing itself?
I guess I'm thinking right now, because I'm writing about the experiences that Peter and I had in Mayerthorpe, and so I guess I'm thinking about how we identify how we tell the story. Because I think I've failed to tell this story with other people for 30 years. I haven't been able to tell the story. So how do you tell the story? How do you find the way that will convey not just the bare facts of what occurred, not the plot, but of the complications of how you felt and how it made you do things and what you did in order to the whole thing. How do you tell the story? I still don't know. I'm still struggling.
All right. Well, I think we can end it there. Is there anything else you want to add, Marina or Callum?
No, I'd like to add that as soon as all this is done, we're going to have another meeting in person.
Yeah.
That'd be wonderful.
So annoying.
I do prefer podcasts in person too.
Mhm.
But
Oh yeah, I didn't even think about that. I don't mind this stuff for podcasts and literary readings and
no.
things. I think it's okay, but I just
Readings, I
what
have
about-
trouble for some reason paying attention. I don't know, over online.
Do you have trouble paying attention while you're talking or watching?
Just talking's fine, but just when I'm hearing somebody read. Luckily for yours, I have the actual works I could read along. And I've read it before, so it helps too. But when I'm just listening to someone read randomly, it's very tough for me to pay attention. And I don't know what that is. In person, fine, but online, I try and close my eyes, everything, and it just doesn't. Something's going on.
There's something going on all over the place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, all right. Well, we'll end it there. I have a million other questions, but you got to stop sometime.
Thank you so much for your careful attention and your real respect for the whole art of writing. And it was really fun to talk to you guys, both of you.